The creature had no name that anyone could speak, so the Galactic Council simply called it Apex Specimen 7, and every soldier who had seen it wished they had never laid eyes on such a thing. Commander Nathan Cole stood behind 15 layers of reinforced glass and watched the monster breathe, each exhale fogging the air inside the containment chamber despite the climate controls working at full power. And he felt a cold fear settle into his bones that he had not felt in 30 years of military service. The beast was massive beyond reason, standing 12 feet tall at the shoulder when it was awake, covered head to tail in scales that gleamed like polished obsidian, and those scales had proven capable of deflecting kinetic rounds and plasma fire alike during the capture operation on Kethros Prime. It had 6 legs, each one ending in claws that the science team had measured at 14 inches long, and those claws had cut through starship hull plating like it was wet paper during the initial encounter. Nathan turned to his second-in-command, a Thelvian officer named Kira Sol, whose gray skin had taken on a greenish tinge that indicated severe anxiety, and he could not blame her for being afraid, because he was afraid too. "How long until the sedatives wear off?" he asked, keeping his voice steady through sheer force of will. Kira checked her datapad with trembling fingers and said, "The medical team estimates 4 hours, Commander, maybe 5 if we are fortunate, but they have already increased the dosage twice, and they are worried about causing permanent damage to the specimen." Nathan almost laughed at that, because the idea of worrying about damaging something that had killed 47 people seemed absurd. But he understood the science division's reasoning, and he knew that High Command wanted this creature alive for study. The capture operation on Kethros Prime had been a disaster from the moment the first survey team landed on that jungle world 3 weeks ago, and Nathan had watched the footage so many times that it played behind his eyes whenever he tried to sleep. The research team had numbered 12 scientists and 8 security personnel, all of them experienced professionals who had explored dozens of worlds without incident. And they had lasted exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds after the creature emerged from the tree line. The footage showed nothing but blur and screaming and blood, a nightmare of black scales and silver claws moving faster than anything that size should be able to move. And by the time the emergency beacon activated, there was no one left alive to rescue. Nathan had led the response team personally, bringing 50 of his best soldiers, armed with stasis projectors and neural disruptors, and enough firepower to level a small city. And they had still lost 17 people before finally bringing the beast down, loaded with enough sedative to drop a battleship before the creature finally stumbled. And even then, it had managed to kill 3 more soldiers before collapsing into unconsciousness. Now it lay in chains forged from neutronium alloy, the strongest material known to galactic science, surrounded by enough weapons to fight a small war, and Nathan knew in his heart that it was not enough. "Why are we keeping it alive?" asked a young soldier named Danny Park, his voice cracking with poorly hidden terror as he stared at the sleeping monster through the observation window. Nathan sighed and rubbed his tired eyes before answering, "Because the science division believes this creature may hold the key to biological weapons development, and because High Command wants to understand how something like this evolved, and because we spent too many lives capturing it to simply destroy it now." Danny nodded, but did not look convinced, and Nathan could not blame him. Convinced either. The creature stirred slightly in its drugged sleep, one massive leg twitching, and every soldier in the observation gallery raised their weapons in unison before realizing it was just a muscle spasm. Kira Sol made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a sob, and Nathan put a hand on her shoulder to steady her because she had been on Kethros Prime too, and she had seen things that would haunt her for the rest of her days. "There is something else, Commander," Kira said after she had composed herself, her antennae twitching nervously as she spoke. High Command has approved the arrival of an exchange student from Earth, a human, and she is scheduled to dock at the station tomorrow morning. Nathan stared at her in disbelief, because humans were still new to the galactic community, having only achieved faster-than-light travel 15 years ago, and sending one to a high-security containment facility seemed like madness. "What we are housing here?" he asked. "Her assignment paperwork simply says Biological Research Assistant," Kira replied. "She has no idea what she is walking into." Nathan cursed under his breath and turned back to the observation window, watching the creature's massive chest rise and fall with each slow breath. And he wondered what kind of bureaucratic insanity had led to this decision. Humans were strange creatures by galactic standards, soft and fragile, and lacking any natural weapons or defenses. And yet there were rumors about them that Nathan had never quite believed until now. Stories from the frontier spoke of humans doing impossible things, surviving situations that should have killed them, forming bonds with creatures that should have torn them apart, and displaying a kind of reckless courage that bordered on insanity. There was a famous incident on Proxima Station, where a human cargo worker had walked into a fight between two Krokan warriors, each one standing 8 feet tall and weighing over 500 pounds, and had somehow walked out carrying both of them unconscious over her shoulders. There was the story of the human engineer, stranded on a desert moon for 3 weeks, with nothing but a knife and a broken radio, who had not only survived, but had built a working distress beacon from salvaged parts and walked 17 miles to reach the rescue shuttle on her own 2 feet. And there was the tale that Nathan found hardest to believe, the one about the human child who had wandered into the enclosure of a Vexian hunting cat at a zoo, and had been found an hour later taking a nap, curled up against the sleeping predator, while its keepers stood frozen in terror. The coalition scientists called it human improbability, a term that meant they had no real explanation for why humans kept defying the odds in ways that made no logical sense. Nathan did not know if any of those stories were true. Most dangerous creature in the galaxy sleep fitfully in its chains. He found himself wondering what would happen when a human came face to face with something that could not be reasoned with, could not be fought, and could not be escaped. The answer, he suspected, would either be a tragedy or a miracle. And standing in that observation gallery, with the weight of 47 deaths pressing down on his shoulders, Commander Nathan Cole was not sure which outcome he feared more. The creature stirred again, and this time its eyes flickered open for just a moment, amber slits that seemed to glow in the dim light of the containment chamber. And Nathan felt those eyes find him through 15 layers of reinforced glass. Then the sedatives pulled it back under, and the moment passed, but Nathan could not shake the feeling that something had just changed. Something important. Something that would alter the course of his life and the lives of everyone on this station in ways he could not begin to imagine. He just did not know it yet. The transport shuttle touched down in Docking Bay 7 at exactly 0900 hours station time, and Grace Miller stepped out into the artificial light with her backpack slung over one shoulder and a thermos of coffee clutched in her hand like a lifeline. She was 22 years old, a graduate student in xenobiology from the University of Montana, and she had won the exchange program lottery that sent promising human students to various coalition research facilities across the galaxy. Her mother had cried when she left Earth, and her father had hugged her so tight she thought her ribs might crack, and her little brother had made her promise to bring back something cool from outer space. Grace had promised, even though she had no idea what kind of cool things one might find on a biological research station in the middle of nowhere. A nervous-looking officer met her at the airlock, his gray skin marked with the distinctive patterns of the Thalvian species, and Grace noticed immediately that he seemed deeply uncomfortable with her presence. "Miss Miller," he said, his words rendered in flat robotic English by the translator device clipped to his collar. I am Lieutenant Tovar Nez, and I have been assigned to orient you to the station and its facilities. Grace smiled warmly and extended her hand in the traditional human greeting, watching as Tovar stared at it for a long moment before remembering the custom and giving it an awkward shake. "Nice to meet you, Lieutenant," Grace said cheerfully. "I have to say, this place is bigger than I expected from the briefing materials." Tovar's skin took on a greenish tinge that Grace had learned to recognize as anxiety during her preparation courses, and she wondered what exactly was making him so nervous. "You are smaller than I anticipated," Tovar admitted, and Grace laughed because she got that a lot. At 5'4", with brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and a face full of freckles that made her look younger than her years, Grace knew she did not cut an imposing figure by any species standards. "Yeah, humans come in all sizes," she said. "I am on the shorter end, but I promise I can keep up with whatever work you need me to do." Tovar nodded and gestured for her to follow him through a maze of corridors that seemed to go on forever, past security checkpoints staffed by soldiers who stared at her with open curiosity and something else she could not quite identify. Grace was used to being stared at because humans were still a novelty in Coalition space, one of the newest species to join the galactic community, and most aliens had never seen one in person before. What she was not used to was the way these soldiers looked at her, like she was a small animal that had wandered into a cage full of predators without realizing the danger. "So what exactly are we researching here?" Grace asked as they walked, break the uncomfortable silence that had settled between them. The briefing materials were pretty vague about the specifics. Tovar's steps faltered for just a moment before he recovered and said, "Perhaps it would be best if I showed you directly, Miss Miller." Grace raised an eyebrow at that non-answer, but decided not to push, figuring she would find out soon enough what all the secrecy was about. They passed through 3 more security checkpoints, each one more heavily armed than the last, and Grace felt her curiosity growing with each locked door and nervous guard. Finally, Tovar stopped in front of a massive blast door, marked with warning symbols in at least a dozen different languages, and Grace recognized the universal signs for biological hazard and extreme danger among them. "Miss Miller," Tovar said carefully, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper, "what I am about to show you is classified at the highest level of Coalition security, and you will be required to sign additional confidentiality waivers before proceeding." Grace nodded, her heart starting to beat a little faster with anticipation. "I must also ask," Tovar continued, "that you remain calm when you see what is inside, because many beings have had strong reactions to the specimen, and we cannot afford any disruptions to its containment." "Specimen?" Grace repeated, her xenobiologist's interest now fully engaged. "What kind of specimen?" Tovar did not answer, just pressed his palm to the security panel and watched as the massive blast door slid open, with a hiss of equalizing pressure. Grace stepped through into an observation gallery that overlooked a containment chamber the size of a football field, and for a moment she forgot how to breathe. The creature, lying in the center of that chamber, was the most magnificent thing she had ever seen. It was enormous, easily 12 feet tall at the shoulder, covered in scales that gleamed like polished black glass under the artificial lights, and Grace could see the powerful muscles rippling beneath that armored hide, even in sleep. 6 legs ended in claws that looked like they could tear through anything, and a long tail curled around the creature's body like a sleeping cat's, and its massive head rested on forelimbs that were thicker than Grace's entire body. "Oh," Grace breathed, pressing her face against the observation window like a child at an aquarium. "Oh, it is beautiful." Behind her, she heard Tovar make a choking sound of disbelief. "Beautiful," repeated a deep voice, and Grace turned to see a tall human man in a commander's uniform staring at her with an expression of utter confusion. "Miss Miller, that creature has killed over 40 people, and it is considered the most dangerous predator ever documented by the Coalition." Grace turned back to the window, studying the creature's sleeping form with the trained eye of someone who had grown up around animals her whole life. "Look at the way those scales overlap," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. "Perfect for deflecting attacks, while still allowing full range of motion. And those claws are clearly designed for both climbing and combat. And the musculature suggests it can probably move at incredible speeds when it wants to." 93 kilometers per hour, the commander said flatly. "We have footage." Grace whistled low and appreciative, and she heard several of the soldiers in the gallery shift uncomfortably at her reaction. "How long has it been in captivity?" she asked. 72 hours, and we have had it sedated the entire time because we cannot risk it waking up while we figure out containment protocols." Grace frowned at that, her mind racing through everything she knew about large predators and the effects of prolonged chemical sedation on their systems. 3 days straight, she said slowly. "That is not good for any animal, and it might actually make things worse when it wakes up." "Worse," laughed a Felvian officer standing near the commander, and Grace recognized her as the species' female equivalent based on her antenna patterns. "Miss Miller, with respect, you did not see what this creature did on Kethros Prime, and there is no worse than what it is capable of." Grace did not argue, but she did not agree either. She had grown up on a ranch in Montana, where the animals were big and the winters were harsh and the nearest hospital was 2 hours away on a good day. And she had learned early that every creature had reasons for what it did, even the dangerous ones. Especially the dangerous ones. "Has anyone tried communicating with it?" Grace asked. "Not through words, but through body language and tone of voice." The silence that followed told her everything she needed to know. "It is not sapient," the commander finally said. "It does not respond to attempts at communication." Grace smiled, and there was something in that smile that made everyone in the observation gallery feel suddenly uncertain about this small human woman who looked at a monster and saw beauty. "Not sapient does not mean not intelligent, Commander," she said quietly, "and I would very much like to try something different when it wakes up." The commander stared at her for a long moment, and Grace could see the war playing out behind his eyes between military caution and desperate hope. "What exactly did you have in mind, Miss Miller?" he asked. Grace turned back to the observation window, watching the creature breathe, watching its massive form rise and fall with each slow exhale. And she thought about all the frightened animals she had gentled over the years back home. "I want to show it that not everything in the universe wants to hurt it," she said simply. And for the first time since the nightmare on Kethros Prime began, Commander Nathan Cole felt something that might have been hope. The argument lasted for 6 hours, and Grace Miller sat through every minute of it without losing her patience or her smile. Commander Nathan Cole paced back and forth across his office like a caged animal, listing every reason why her plan was insane, while his officers nodded in agreement, and Grace listened respectfully to each objection before calmly explaining why she still wanted to try. "You will die," Nathan said for what must have been the 20th time. "That creature will tear you apart before any of us can react, and I will have to write a letter to your family explaining how I let a human student walk into a death trap." Grace took a sip of her coffee, which had gone cold hours ago, but she drank it anyway because she needed something to do with her hands. "Commander, I understand your concerns, and I appreciate that you are trying to protect me. But I have spent my whole life around dangerous animals, and I know what I am doing." "Dangerous animal," Kira Soul interjected, her antennae twitching with agitation. "This is an apex predator that has killed everything it has ever encountered, and it does not think like the animals on your homeworld." Grace set down her thermos and leaned forward in her chair, meeting Kira's eyes with a steady gaze. "You found this creature alone on a jungle planet, right? With no others of its kind anywhere nearby?" Kira nodded reluctantly. "So imagine what that was like for it," Grace continued. "Imagine being the only one of your species, surrounded by a world full of things you do not understand. And then one day these strange beings show up, with machines and lights and sounds you have never seen before, and they point things at you that hurt, and they chase you, and they try to capture you. She paused, letting her words sink in. What would you do in that situation, Lieutenant, if you were scared and alone and did not know what was happening? Opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, her expression troubled. I would fight, Nathan said quietly. I would fight with everything I had, because I would think I was going to die if I did not. Grace nodded and said, Exactly, and maybe that is all this creature has been doing this whole time. Maybe it is not a mindless killer at all. Maybe it is just terrified and does not know any other way to protect itself. The room went silent as everyone considered her words. Even if you are right, Nathan finally said, even if this creature is acting out of fear rather than aggression, that does not change the fact that it will kill you the moment you step into that chamber. Grace smiled and said, Maybe it will, but maybe it will not. And you have been trying force for 3 days now, with nothing to show for it, except a creature that is getting more and more stressed. So what do you have to lose by letting me try something different? Tired eyes, and slumped back in his chair, looking suddenly older than his years. What exactly would you need from us? He asked. Grace felt her heart skip with hope, because that question meant he was at least considering her proposal. I need you to let the sedatives wear off naturally, without adding more drugs to its system, and I need to be in the chamber when it wakes up, and I need all of you to promise not to interfere unless I specifically ask for help. No weapons? Nathan asked. No weapons, no armor, no emergency beacon, nothing that would make the creature think I am a threat. Kira made a sound of disbelief and said, You want to face that thing with nothing at all to protect yourself? I want to face it as myself, Grace replied. Just a person, nothing more, and animals can always tell when you are carrying something that could hurt them. So if I want this to work, I need to be completely vulnerable. The officers exchanged glances, and Grace could see them silently debating whether to let her go through with this plan or to lock her in her quarters for her own safety. Finally, Nathan stood up and walked to the window of his office, staring out at the stars for a long moment before speaking. My daughter is about your age, he said softly. She lives on Earth with her mother, and I have not seen her in 3 years because of this assignment. And if she ever did something this crazy, I would probably have a heart attack. Grace waited, sensing that he had more to say. But she also inherited her mother's stubborn streak, and once she makes up her mind about something, there is no changing it. And I have a feeling you are the same way. He turned back to face her, and Grace saw something shift in his expression. We will do it your way, Miss Miller, but I am stationing my 50 best soldiers around that chamber, and if that creature so much as looks at you wrong, I am giving the order to fire. Grace nodded and said, I understand, Commander, and thank you for trusting me. I am not trusting you, Nathan replied with a tired smile. I am trusting the universe to not be completely cruel for once in my life. The preparations took another 2 hours, and Grace spent that time sitting in her temporary quarters, going over everything she knew about predator behavior and body language and the subtle cues that animals use to communicate across species barriers. She thought about the horses on her family's ranch that had been too wild for anyone else to handle, and she remembered the first time she had approached one of them with nothing but patience and an open hand, and she remembered the way its eyes had changed when it realized she was not going to hurt it. She thought about the stray dog that had wandered onto their property when she was 12, a big scarred thing that growled at everyone who came near, and she remembered how she had spent 3 weeks sitting in the barn with it every day, not trying to touch it or talk to it, just being present, until one morning it had walked over and laid its head in her lap. She thought about her grandmother's words, spoken so many times they had become a part of her soul. Every creature wants to feel safe, Grace, and every creature wants to know it is not alone. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is sit still and let them come to you. At 0300 hours station time, Grace Miller walked into Containment Chamber 1 and sat down on the cold metal floor 20 meters from the sleeping form of Apex Specimen 7. The 50 soldiers stationed around the chamber had their weapons trained on the creature, their faces tight with fear and determination, and Grace knew they would not hesitate to fire if things went wrong. She did not look at them. She kept her eyes on the creature, watching its massive chest rise and fall with each slow breath, watching its legs twitch occasionally as it dreamed whatever dreams such a being might have. The sedatives began to wear off at 0347, and Grace saw the first signs of consciousness return in the way the creature's breathing changed and its muscles tensed. She took a deep breath of her own and let it out slowly, relaxing her body and her mind, letting go of fear and expectation, and everything except the present moment. The creature's eyes opened. They were amber, deep and bright and ancient, slitted like a cat's, and they found Grace immediately with an intensity that would have sent most beings running for their lives. Grace met that gaze calmly, and then she did something that made every observer in the gallery gasp with shock. She yawned. It was a deliberate, exaggerated yawn, the kind that showed all her teeth and stretched her jaw wide, and among Earth predators it was a signal of complete non-aggression. Went very still. Grace followed the yawn with a slow blink, another signal that meant trust and safety. And then she simply sat there, with her hands resting open on her knees, radiating calm. The creature did not move. Neither did Grace. The standoff lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, and the only sound in the chamber was the soft hum of the environmental systems and the creature's slow breathing. Then, impossibly, the beast began to rise. The creature rose to its full height, and Grace Miller felt the floor vibrate beneath her as 12 feet of armored predator unfolded itself from the chains that had held it prisoner for 3 days. Those chains, forged from neutronium alloy that was supposed to be unbreakable, snapped like dry twigs as the creature stretched its 6 powerful legs and shook off the last fog of the sedatives. In the observation gallery, Commander Nathan Cole opened his mouth to give the order to fire, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. But something stopped him. Grace had not moved. She sat exactly where she had been sitting, cross-legged on the cold metal floor, her hands resting open on her knees, her eyes still locked with the creature's amber gaze. The soldiers surrounding the chamber had their fingers on their triggers, every instinct screaming at them to shoot, but they held their fire because they could see what Nathan saw was not attacking, and it stood motionless, its massive head tilted slightly to one side, like a dog trying to understand a new sound. And it watched the small human woman with an expression that might have been confusion or curiosity, or something no one in that room had ever seen before. Grace kept her breathing slow and steady, in through her nose and out through her mouth, the way her grandmother had taught her when she was learning to gentle wild horses back home. "Hey there," she said softly, keeping her voice low and warm. "You have had a rough few days, huh?" The creature's ears, small ridged things that Grace had not noticed before, swiveled toward the sound of her voice. "I bet you are tired," Grace continued. "I bet you are scared, and I bet you miss your home, and I bet everything here feels wrong and cold and strange." The creature took a step toward her. In the gallery, Kira Saul made a strangled sound of terror. Grace did not flinch. "I know what that is like," she said, still in that same soft voice. "I am a long way from my home too, and sometimes at night I miss it so much it hurts, and I just want to go back to where everything makes sense. Another step. The creature was close enough now that Grace could see the individual scales on its face, each one perfectly formed, each one capable of deflecting weapons that could punch through starship hulls. "But you know what helps when I feel that way?" Grace asked. "Having someone nearby who doesn't want to hurt me. Someone who just sits with me and lets me feel what I'm feeling without trying to fix it or fight it." The creature stopped 3 meters away, its amber eyes never leaving Grace's face, and it made a sound. It was not a roar or a growl, but something lower and deeper, a rumble that Grace felt in her chest more than she heard with her ears. She recognized that sound. She had heard something like it from the big cats at the zoo, back home, and from the farm dogs when they were content, and from her grandmother's ancient tabby when it curled up in a sunny spot by the window. It was a sound of uncertainty becoming curiosity. "Yeah," Grace said, her lips curving into a gentle smile. "I know, buddy, I know. None of this makes any sense to you, does it?" She slowly, carefully, raised one hand and held it out palm up, the way you might offer your scent to an unfamiliar dog. "You can check me out if you want," she said. "I promise I am not going to do anything scary. I'm just going to sit here, and you can do whatever you need to do to feel safe." The creature's nostrils flared as it caught her scent, and Grace watched its massive head lower toward her outstretched hand, with a grace that seemed impossible for something so large. Hot breath washed over their skin, carrying a smell like ozone and copper and something else she could not identify. And Grace held perfectly still as the creature sniffed her hand, her arm, her hair, her face. It was so close now that she could see herself reflected in those amber eyes, a tiny human figure sitting calmly in front of something that could end her life with a single twitch of those terrible claws. Then the creature did something that no one expected. It sat down. The impact shook the floor and sent tremors through the walls, and Grace heard several people in the gallery cry out in surprise. But she kept her attention focused on the creature in front of her. It had folded its 6 legs beneath its body, the way a cat might settle onto a favorite cushion, and it was watching her with an expression that had shifted from confusion to something almost like hope. "Good boy," Grace said softly. "Good boy. That is right. You just take your time. There is no rush. We have got all the time in the world." The creature made that rumbling sound again, and this time Grace was sure it was a sound of comfort rather than threat. She began to talk, not about anything important, just the kind of gentle nonsense she might say to a nervous animal back home. She told it about the ranch in Montana, and the horses, and the big sky that went on forever. She told it about her little brother who wanted to be an astronaut, and her mother who made the best apple pie in 3 counties, and her father who could fix anything with enough duct tape and determination. She told it about the stray dog that had become her best friend, and the barn cat that slept on her pillow every night, and the wild mustang she had spent a whole summer gentling until it would eat from her hand. And as she talked, the creature began to relax. Its muscles loosened, its breathing slowed, and the tension that had been coiled through its massive body like a spring began to unwind. Then, impossibly, beautifully, Apex Specimen 7 laid down beside Grace Miller and rested its enormous head in her lap. The observation gallery. Commander Nathan Cole dropped his communicator. It clattered to the floor, and he did not even notice, because he could not tear his eyes away from the scene before him. From this small human woman sitting on the floor with the most dangerous creature in the galaxy sleeping peacefully in her lap. "That is impossible," Kira Saul whispered. "That is completely impossible." But it was happening. Grace was stroking the creature's head now, her small fingers finding the soft spots between the armored scales, and the creature was making a sound that could only be described as a purr. "There you go," Grace said gently. "There you go, buddy. Just rest now. You are safe. Nobody is going to hurt you while I am here." The soldiers around the chamber had lowered their weapons without being ordered to, too stunned to maintain their combat stance in the face of something that defied everything they thought they knew about the universe. Found his voice and activated the intercom with shaking hands. "Miss Miller," he said, and his voice came out rough and strange. "Miss Miller, are you all right?" Grace looked up at the observation window and smiled, and Nathan saw tears on her cheeks. "I am fine, Commander," she said. "We are both fine." She looked back down at the creature in her lap, at the terrible claws curled peacefully against the floor, at the scales that could deflect plasma fire, at the closed eyes that had once held nothing but rage and fear. "I think he was just lonely," Grace said quietly. "I think he was the only one of his kind, and he did not know how to ask for help. And all that violence was just his way of screaming into the void, hoping someone would understand." She scratched behind one of his ear ridges, and the purring intensified. "Everyone needs someone, Commander," Grace Miller said. "Even monsters." And for the first time in 3 days, Containment Station Omega was silent, not with fear, with wonder. The report that Commander Nathan Cole sent to High Command was met with disbelief, then demands for verification, then a flood of scientists and officials who wanted to see the impossible with their own eyes. They found Grace Miller exactly where she had been for the past 18 hours, sitting in the containment chamber that had been redesignated as Habitat 1, with the most dangerous creature in the galaxy curled around her like an enormous scaly dog. She had named it Max. Nathan had protested that giving the creature a name compromised scientific objectivity, but Grace had just laughed and said that Max was already more than a specimen to her, and besides, every living thing deserved a name. The creature had woken twice during those 18 hours, and both times it had simply looked at Grace, made that strange purring rumble, and gone back to sleep with its head in her lap. The head xenobiologist, a Falari named Dr. Sar Then, gallery with his mouth hanging open and his datapad forgotten in his hands. "I do not understand," he said, for what must have been the 100th time since arriving on the station. This creature displayed extreme aggression toward every other life form it encountered. It killed without hesitation. How can it simply accept her? Grace's voice came through the intercom, calm and patient, despite answering the same question over and over. "He was not hunting when he attacked the research team," she said. "He was terrified, and think about it from his perspective. He was alone on that planet with no others of his kind. And then these strange beings showed up with machines and equipment he had never seen before." She stroked Max's scales as she spoke, and the creature made a contented sound in its sleep. "He did not attack because he is a mindless killer," Grace continued. "He attacked because he was scared and did not know what else to do. A weapon at him. It just confirmed his belief that the universe was full of things that wanted to hurt him." Dr. Then shook his head in amazement and said, "That is an enormous assumption, Miss Miller." "Maybe," Grace replied with a smile, "but it is working, is it not?" Nathan stepped forward and cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "Miss Miller, I have been in the military for 30 years, and I have seen things that would give most people nightmares, but I have never seen anything like what you did in that chamber." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "How did you know it would not kill you?" he asked. "How did you know you could trust something that had murdered so many people?" Grace was quiet for a long moment, her hands still moving gently over Max's scales. "I did not know," she admitted, "not for certain, but I grew up on a ranch in Montana, where the animals were big and the mistakes were costly. Creatures, when your life depends on it." She looked up at the observation window, and Nathan saw something ancient and wise in her young eyes. "You learn that most aggression is just fear wearing a different face," Grace said. And you learn that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is sit down and be still, and let them come to you. Kira Sol spoke up from her position near the back of the gallery. Your species has only been in space for 15 years, she said. You have no natural weapons, no armor, no remarkable physical abilities, and by every measure, you should be one of the weaker species in the coalition. She gestured at the sleeping apex predator. And yet one of your students just did what 50 armed soldiers could not, Kira continued. She tamed the untamable. Grace shook her head and said, We do not call it taming on Earth, we call it befriending, and Max is not tamed. He is just starting to trust, and there is a big. The distinction seemed lost on most of the observers. But Nathan understood what she meant. He had seen the same thing in soldiers who had been through trauma. The slow rebuilding of faith in the world. The gradual acceptance that not everyone was an enemy. What happens now? He asked. Grace looked down at Max, at his terrible claws, and his armored scales, and his massive form that could tear through starship hulls. Now we take it slow, she said. We build trust. We figure out what he needs to be healthy and happy. And maybe eventually we find out if there are more of his kind somewhere, if he has family looking for him. A coalition official stepped forward, a bureaucrat type with cold eyes and an expensive suit. The science division has plans for this creature, he said. Plans that involve extensive study of its offensive capabilities. And we cannot simply abandon that research because a human student has formed an emotional connection. Grace's expression did not change, but something shifted in her eyes. Nathan had seen that look before, in the eyes of mother bears defending their cubs, and in the faces of soldiers protecting their comrades. Max is not a weapon, Grace said quietly. He is a living being who deserves to be treated with dignity, and I will be staying right here to make sure that happens. The official opened his mouth to argue, but Nathan cut him off. The creature responds to Miss Miller, he said firmly. Until we understand why and how, she stays, and any research will be conducted with her approval and participation. The official looked like he wanted to protest, but one glance at the 50 soldiers in the room and the deadly calm on Grace's face seemed to change his mind. This is not over, he muttered as he left the gallery. Grace watched him go, then turned her attention back to Max. In the weeks that followed, footage of Grace's first contact with Apex Specimen 7 spread across the galactic network, viewed billions of times by beings who could not believe what they were seeing. Scientists wrote papers about human improbability and Terran empathic bonding. Military analysts tried to replicate her success, and failed completely, and philosophers debated what it meant that a species so physically unremarkable could achieve something so extraordinary. But Grace did not care about any of that. She cared about Max, who had started following her around Habitat 1 like an enormous, terrifying puppy. She cared about the slow progress they were making in understanding his species and his needs. She cared about the moment when he would make that rumbling purr, and she would know that he felt safe and loved. And sometimes, late at night when the station was quiet, and the stars wheeled slowly past the viewport, Grace would sit in Habitat 1, with Max curled around her, like a living mountain. She would think about how strange and wonderful the universe was. It had taken 50 soldiers to contain the apex creature. It had taken one human to show it kindness. And that, more than any weapon or technology, was what made humanity special. Not their strength, or their intelligence, or their ability to adapt. Their capacity for compassion. Their willingness to see the frightened child hiding inside the monster. Their stubborn insistence on believing that everything deserved a chance at connection and belonging. They found Max's family eventually, a small population on a distant moon that the surveys had missed. And Grace cried when she realized she would have to say goodbye. But Max came back to visit her every year until the end of her days, crossing the vastness of space to spend a few precious weeks with the human who had seen through his armor and found something worth loving underneath. The galaxy had a lot of words for what it meant. Humans did. Improbability, they called it, or Terran bonding, or emotional manipulation. But Grace Miller knew the truth. It was not complicated at all. It was just love. And love, it turned out, was the most powerful force in the universe. More powerful than neutronium chains. More powerful than 50 soldiers with plasma rifles. More powerful than fear. That was the lesson humanity taught the stars. That was their gift to the galaxy, and it changed everything. Forever.